She held the dying soldier's hand as cannons thundered overhead, blood soaking through her apron while she whispered promises she couldn't keep. You might think angels only exist in heaven, but during America's darkest hour, one walked through hell itself. Clara Barton wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't allowed on battlefields. But when boys barely old enough to shave lay screaming in the mud, bleeding out while waiting for help that would never come, propriety became irrelevant. Picture this: April 1861. The Civil War had just begun, and nobody understood the horror that was coming. Not the politicians, not the generals, certainly not the young men who marched off singing. But Clara Barton saw it coming. She watched the first wounded arrive in Washington, saw hospitals overflow, witnessed soldiers dying not from bullets but from neglect. And she made a decision that would change everything. Before the war, Clara was just a patent clerk. A quiet woman living the unremarkable life society expected. But sometimes history doesn't choose its heroes from the powerful. Sometimes it picks a 39-year-old spinster with no medical training and no authority. What she had was something far more dangerous: the absolute conviction that she could not watch boys die when she could help. The first time she stepped onto a battlefield, officers tried to stop her. "This is no place for a woman," they said. She looked them straight in the eye and asked, "Then who will hold their hands when they die?" They had no answer. She pushed past them, knelt in the blood-soaked earth, and began her work. What would you have done? Would you have turned back when bullets whizzed past your head? Clara didn't. At Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, she worked for 3 straight days without sleep. A bullet passed through her sleeve and killed the man she was treating. She didn't even pause. She closed his eyes, said a prayer, and moved to the next soldier. They called her the angel of the battlefield, but angels don't usually have to beg for supplies. Angels don't have to fight bureaucrats for bandages while men die. Clara did all of this. She used her own money, built a supply network from nothing, and drove wagons through combat zones herself. Think about that choice. Every battlefield meant exposure to disease and enemy fire. But she knew that without her, thousands would die. Not from Confederate bullets, but from Union neglect. So one woman decided she would fill the gap. You want to know what courage looks like? It's a middle-aged woman in a blood-stained dress working by candlelight while shells explode overhead. It's searching for wounded among the dead, even when snipers use your lantern as a target. Clara Barton showed us that heroism isn't about glory. It's about seeing suffering and refusing to look away. The screams started before dawn. You've never heard sounds like those echoing across Civil War battlefields after fighting stopped. Thousands of voices crying out in darkness. For water, for mothers, for death itself. This was Clara Barton's soundtrack. While generals planned, in comfortable tents she waded through fields of broken bodies. Fredericksburg, December 1862. The Union Army had been slaughtered. Wounded soldiers lay freezing for days because medics couldn't reach them. Clara hijacked a wagon, loaded supplies, and drove across a bridge under Confederate fire. When soldiers tried to stop her, she pointed at the dying and asked, "Will you shoot me for saving them?" She found horrors beyond imagination. Men with limbs torn off, wounds black with frostbite. Boys delirious, reliving their last battle. Some had lain in blood so long it froze, gluing them to the ground. Clara worked through the night. When dawn came, her dress was stiff with frozen blood, but she kept moving. What haunted her most wasn't the death, but preventable suffering. Boys died from infections basic care could have prevented. They starved because supply lines failed. The Union had resources, but bureaucracy killed as surely as bullets. Each preventable death was a betrayal, but Clara didn't wait for permission. She created her own distribution network. When bandages ran out, she tore up her petticoats. She became a one-woman logistics operation. Officials who'd tried keeping her away now begged for help. At Fort Wagner, the assault had failed. Wounded soldiers lay abandoned as tide came in. Officers declared rescue too dangerous. Clara said, "Then I'll go alone." She walked onto that beach under a full moon, Confederate rifles trained on her, dragging men to safety one by one. Can you imagine that moment? A lone woman on a moonlit beach surrounded by the dead and dying, knowing any second could bring a bullet. But she kept going, because if she didn't, who would? Other volunteers, shamed by her example, finally joined her. Together, they saved dozens who would have drowned. The soldiers started calling her Mother. Not nurse, not miss, Mother. Because in their darkest moments, she was there. When fever dreams transported them home, she was the gentle hand on their forehead. When they cried out in pain, she was the voice saying, "I'm here." She became what they needed most. Proof that someone cared whether they lived or died. You think you know exhaustion? Clara Barton once stayed awake for 5 straight days during the Battle of the Wilderness. 5 days of amputations without anesthesia, of holding men down while surgeons sawed through bone, of pressing cloth against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. By the end, she was hallucinating from lack of sleep, seeing her dead brother Stephen among the wounded. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant letting them die alone. The wilderness was different from other battles. The forest caught fire, and wounded men burned alive in the underbrush. You could hear their screams above the gunfire. Soldiers risked their lives trying to drag comrades from the flames. Many died trying. Clara organized bucket brigades, not to fight the fire, that was impossible, but to create fire breaks around field hospitals. She saved hundreds that day, though the smell of burning flesh haunted her forever. What drives someone to keep going in conditions like that? For Clara, it was the letters. Every dead soldier meant a mother who'd never see her son again, a wife who'd become a widow, children who'd grow up fatherless. She carried their letters in her apron pockets. Last words home, messages of love, final requests. When she couldn't save a soldier, she'd promised to deliver his words. She kept every promise. One letter still survives. Private Charles Hamilton, age 19, dying of a stomach wound. Tell Mother I wasn't afraid. Tell her I thought of home. Tell her about the lady who held my hand. Clara held his hand for 6 hours as he died. Then she wrote to his mother, adding her own message. Your son died bravely. He spoke of you until the end. I was with him. He was not alone. How many such letters did she write? Thousands. Each one a sacred duty. She described their last moments, assure families their boys died peacefully even when they hadn't. Was it lying? Maybe. But what truth would serve a grieving mother better? That her son died screaming or that someone cared enough to comfort him? Clara chose mercy over honesty. She carried their pain so families wouldn't have to. The government noticed her work, finally. They offered her an official position, a salary, recognition. She turned it down. You know why? Because official positions came with restrictions. Rules about where she could go, what supplies she could distribute, which soldiers deserved help. Clara had seen what bureaucracy did to relief efforts. She'd rather work alone with limited resources than become another cog in the machine that failed these boys daily. But working alone meant bearing witness alone. No one to share the burden when a teenage soldier begged her to kill him because the pain was too much. No one to lean on when she recognized a former student among the dead. No one to understand why she'd wake screaming, reliving the moment. A shell exploded and covered her in the blood and brain matter of the man she'd been treating. Have you ever made a promise to a dying man? Clara Barton made thousands. But one promise changed her life forever. A soldier named Jonathan Letterman, gut-shot and fading, grabbed her wrist and made her swear, "Don't let them forget us. Don't let our families wonder." She promised. He died never knowing that keeping that promise would consume the next 4 years of her life. The Civil War ended in 1865, but for thousands of families, it never really ended. They waited for sons who never came home. No letters, no word of death, just silence. Over 400,000 soldiers were listed as missing. Can you imagine that torture? Not knowing if your boy died instantly or lingered in agony, not knowing where he was buried, not even having a grave to visit, just questions that ate at you every single day. Clara couldn't forget those families. She'd seen too many boys die calling for mothers who'd never know their fate. So she did, something unprecedented. She opened an office, the Office of Missing Soldiers. Using her own money, she placed ads in newspapers asking for information. The response overwhelmed her. Letters poured in by the thousands. Mothers begging for any scrap of information. Wives clinging to hope their husbands might still be alive. She worked 18-hour days, cross-referencing burial records, hospital, logs, prison camp rolls. When paperwork failed, she interviewed survivors. Did you know James McCarthy from Ohio? Red hair, scar on his left hand? Most leads went nowhere, but sometimes, glorious sometimes, she'd match a name to a grave. She'd write to the family, "Your son rests in Salisbury National Cemetery, Section B, Row 12. For them, the war could finally end. The work broke her health and drained her savings. Friends begged her to stop. The war was over, they said. Let the dead bury the dead. But Clara had stood in too many field hospitals, made too many deathbed promises. She knew what others couldn't. That for families left wondering, the war would never end until they knew. So she kept going, even when it meant selling her own belongings to pay for postage. Then came Andersonville. You've heard of it, the Confederate prison camp where 13,000 Union soldiers died. When the war ended, those 13,000 lay in trenches, marked only by numbered stakes. The numbers meant nothing without records. Clara convinced the government to let her expedition identify the dead. She brought Dorrance Atwater, a survivor who'd secretly copied burial records. Together, they gave names to the nameless. Standing in that Georgia heat, surrounded by 13,000 graves, Clara wept. Not just for the dead, but for the living who'd waited so long for answers. She supervised the placement of headstones, ensuring each carved name was correct. Because after everything these boys had suffered, they deserved at least that. Their names remembered, their graves marked, their families given the peace of knowing. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Identifying bodies at Andersonville nearly killed her. The stress, the heat, the emotional toll of reading 13,000 names of boys who'd starved to death. It triggered a breakdown. She collapsed at the cemetery, burning with fever, hallucinating that the dead were rising from their graves to thank her. They had to carry her out on a stretcher. You want to know what PTSD looked like before we had a name for it? Look at Clara Barton in 1868. She'd identified over 22,000 missing soldiers, given closure to countless families. But the cost was written on her body. Her hair had turned gray. Her hands shook constantly. She couldn't sleep without nightmares of burning forests and dying boys. Doctors ordered her to stop, to rest, to forget. As if anyone could forget the things she'd seen. She tried to return to normal life. Took a job at the patent office again. Sat at a desk filing papers while memories of Antietam played behind her eyes. Can you imagine? Going from saving lives on battlefields to stamping documents? From being the angel of the battlefield to being just another government clerk? The mundane cruelty of peacetime nearly destroyed her. Her body rebelled. Mysterious illnesses plagued her. Paralysis that came and went. Fevers that left her bedridden for weeks. Modern doctors would recognize trauma manifesting physically. But 1860s medicine just prescribed rest and laudanum. Clara knew better. She wasn't sick from overwork. She was sick from having no work that mattered. She'd found her purpose in war's horror. Peace left her purposeless. So when doctors ordered a rest cure in Europe, she went reluctantly. She expected to spend months in Swiss sanitariums taking therapeutic baths, forgetting. Instead, she found a new war. The Franco-Prussian War erupted in 1870, and Clara watched Europe tear itself apart just as America had. But this time she noticed something different. A red cross on white background marking wagons and hospitals as neutral. The International Red Cross. This organization was everything she'd tried to create alone during the Civil War. Neutral humanitarian aid, recognized by all combatants, protected supply lines, organized relief efforts. She met with Red Cross founders, studied their methods, saw what coordinated humanitarian work could accomplish, and she had a revelation. America needed this. The next war would come. Wars always came, and America would be just as unprepared as before. But when she returned home fired with purpose, nobody wanted to hear it. Government officials dismissed her. America doesn't need the Red Cross, they said. We'll never have. Another war like that. The same men who'd bungled medical supplies during the Civil War now claimed they'd learned their lessons. Clara knew better. She'd seen how quickly institutions forgot hard-won wisdom, how peacetime bred complacency. She spent 12 years fighting for the American Red Cross. 12 years of speeches, lobbying, begging officials to see what she saw. They called her obsessed, said she couldn't let go of the war. They were right. She couldn't let go, because she knew what they'd forgotten, that when the next crisis came, it would be too late to prepare. That somewhere, someday, American boys would die needlessly again unless someone built the infrastructure to save them. The rejection nearly broke her. Former allies dismissed her as a bitter old woman clinging to past glory. Newspapers that had celebrated the angel of the battlefield now mocked her crusade. But Clara had faced Confederate artillery. She'd held dying men in her arms. She'd made promises to ghosts. What was mockery compared to that? They say success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. For 12 years, Clara Barton's American Red Cross was an orphan. You know what sustained her through those dark years? The letters, not from politicians or power brokers, but from soldiers she'd saved. Miss Barton, my children exist because you kept me alive. I name my daughter Clara in your honor. These men understood what officials couldn't, that organized humanitarian aid wasn't about the last war, but the next one. Finally, in 1881, something shifted. Maybe it was the new president, James Garfield, who'd been a Civil War general and seen the chaos firsthand. Maybe America was ready to admit it wasn't immune to disaster, or maybe Clara had simply worn them down through sheer persistence. But on May 21st, 1881, the American Red Cross was born. Clara was 60 years old. Most people her age were thinking about retirement. She was just getting started. You think the Civil War prepared her for anything? The Johnstown flood of 1889 proved otherwise. An entire city wiped out in minutes when a dam burst. Over 2,200 dead. Bodies hanging from trees miles downstream. Survivors huddled on rooftops, watching everything they owned wash away. When Clara arrived with the Red Cross, she found chaos that made battlefields look organized. At least in war, you knew who the enemy was. She set up operations in a muddy tent, working by lantern light. The need was overwhelming. Food, shelter, clothing, medical care, hope. But Clara had learned something crucial during the war. Disaster relief wasn't just about material aid. It was about restoring dignity. She didn't just hand out blankets. She helped people rebuild homes. She didn't just distribute food, she helped restart businesses. She understood that true relief meant helping people help themselves. Watch how she worked. A widow with 6 children had lost everything. Instead of just giving her supplies, Clara helped her set up a boarding house for relief workers. The woman went from victim to provider, from dependent to self-sufficient. That was Clara's genius, seeing past immediate need to long-term recovery. She stayed in Johnstown for 5 months, long after other relief agencies left, because she knew disaster's real cruelty came after the cameras turned away. But here's what they don't put in textbooks. Disaster relief broke her heart differently than war. In battle, death had purpose, however twisted. Boys died for causes they believed in. But in Johnstown, children drowned because rich men built a dam poorly. Families perished because warnings were ignored. The preventable nature of civilian disasters enraged her in ways military casualties never had. She channeled that rage into preparation, creating Red Cross protocols that would save thousands in future disasters. The work was killing her, friends warned. She was 70, working harder than people half her age. Her health failed repeatedly. But every time she tried to rest, Another disaster struck. Hurricanes in Galveston, earthquakes in Charleston, forest fires in Michigan. Each crisis pulled her back. How could she rest when she'd seen what unpreparedness cost? When she knew that her presence meant the difference between chaos and coordinated relief? What drives someone to sacrifice their health, their wealth, their peace for strangers? For Clara, it was memory. The memory of a boy at Antietam asking for water and getting none because supply lines failed. The memory of families waiting forever for news that never came. She'd seen what happened when systems failed human need. She couldn't unsee it. Picture this. Clara Barton, age 76, on a ship to Cuba in 1898. The Spanish-American War had begun, and once again, America was unprepared. Young soldiers were dying of disease before they ever saw combat. The government that swore it had learned from the Civil War was repeating every mistake. Clara could have said, "I told you so." Instead, she packed her bags and headed for the fever camps of Cuba. What she found there defied description. American boys lying in their own filth, burning with typhoid and malaria. Medical supplies rotting on docks because nobody organized distribution. Soldiers drinking contaminated water because nobody thought to purify it. More Americans would die from disease than Spanish bullets. Clara had seen this before, 37 years earlier. Nothing had changed except the geography. She worked in 100-degree heat, her aging body struggling with conditions that would challenge someone half her age. But you know what infuriated her most? It wasn't the physical hardship, it was the waste. The unnecessary suffering, the preventable deaths. She'd spent decades building the Red Cross precisely to avoid this scenario. Yet here she was, watching history repeat itself because politicians preferred patriotic speeches to practical preparation. One image haunted her. A soldier, delirious with fever, calling her mother and begging for water. For a moment she was back at Antietam, young again, holding another dying boy. Time collapsed. All the years between dissolved. She was still that woman trying to bring order to chaos, mercy to suffering. The uniform colors changed. The enemies changed, but the pain remained constant. War's one eternal truth. But something was different this time. The press followed her everywhere. The angel of the battlefield had become a living legend. Reporters watched this elderly woman work 20-hour days in crushing heat and asked how she did it. Her answer was simple. You don't stop to think about it. You see need, you fill it. Thinking comes later. But late at night, in her tent, thinking did come. And with it, a terrible realization. She was exhausted, not just physically, spiritually. She'd spent 40 years fighting the same battles against indifference and incompetence. She'd built an organization, trained successors, created systems. Yet here she was, still doing fieldwork because the systems weren't enough. Because when crisis came, people still looked for the angel of the battlefield, not the Red Cross. She'd become both savior and obstacle, her presence necessary, but preventing the organization from standing on its own. The Spanish-American War lasted only months, but it aged Clara years. When she returned home, observers were shocked. The woman who'd seemed immortal looked every one of her 77 years. Her hands trembled constantly now. Her famous energy flickered like a candle in wind. But still, she worked. Because if she stopped, who would answer the next call? Who would remember the lessons written in blood? She began writing her memoirs, racing against time and failing memory. So many stories to preserve. So many names to record. Boys who died heroically. Bureaucrats who killed through incompetence. Heroes whose names history would forget. She wrote, compulsively, as if documenting suffering could somehow prevent its repetition. As if testimony could teach what experience hadn't. You know what haunts old soldiers? Not the battles they fought, but the ones they see coming. Clara Barton spent her final years watching storm clouds gather over Europe, knowing another great war was inevitable. She'd seen how quickly nations forgot Peace's lessons, how new technology made old mercy obsolete. In letters to friends, she worried about the next generation. Would they remember what the Red Cross was for when machine guns replaced muskets? By 1904, the organization she'd built was pushing her out. Younger board members wanted modern management, not battlefield stories. They accused her of financial mismanagement, of being stuck in the past. The woman who'd revolutionized disaster relief was now seen as an obstacle to progress. The bitter irony, they were partly right. Clara had never learned to delegate. She'd built the Red Cross as an extension of herself, not an institution that could outlive her. The power struggle turned ugly. Public hearings, newspaper scandals. The angel of the battlefield dragged through mud by people who'd never heard. A shot fired in anger. They forced her to resign in 1904. She was 83, had given everything to the Red Cross, and they discarded her like outdated equipment. She returned to her home in Glen Echo, Maryland, surrounded by memories and silence. But here's what her critics never understood. Clara Barton wasn't fighting for power. She was fighting against forgetting. She'd seen how quickly institutions lost their founding purpose, how bureaucracy strangled compassion. Her resistance wasn't stubbornness, it was prophecy. Within a decade, the Red Cross would face world war, a catastrophe beyond her worst nightmares. Would they remember her lessons when poison gas replaced bullets? She spent her last years in that house, writing letters to old soldiers who still called her mother, reading newspapers about international tensions, tending a small garden where she grew the same vegetables she'd once distributed to scurvy-ridden troops. Visitors found her sharp-minded but tired, still ready to discuss disaster preparedness, but aware her time had passed. She'd become history, while still living. What does a warrior do when wars end? Clara never found out. Even in retirement, she kept supply lists updated, maintained correspondence with disaster relief workers worldwide. When the San Francisco earthquake struck in 1906, the 84-year-old woman tried to organize a relief expedition from her parlor. Friends had to physically restrain her from boarding a train west. The spirit was willing, but finally, the flesh was weak. She knew she was dying by 1910. Tuberculosis, the doctor said, though she suspected it was simply time. 70 years of other people's pain had to rest somewhere. As she weakened, memories sharpened. She could recall every detail of Antietam but forgot what she'd eaten for breakfast. Time bent strangely. Past and present merged. Sometimes she called for supplies to be loaded, convinced she was late for a battlefield. In her final weeks, she asked to be read letters from soldiers she'd saved. Thousands of them, stored in boxes throughout her house. Each one proof that individual action mattered, that one person could stand against suffering's tide. Her nurses thought it morbid, this dying woman surrounding herself with war's ghosts. But Clara knew better. These weren't ghosts. They were victories. Each letter represented a life continued, families reunited, futures made possible. April 12, 1912. Clara Barton died as she had lived, without fanfare, without complaint, still planning. Her last coherent words were about supply distribution for a disaster that existed only in her fading mind. You might think that's tragic, this woman dying while still fighting forgotten battles. But consider this, she died ready. After 90 years, she was still prepared to answer suffering's call. How many of us can say the same? The funeral was small. The angel of the battlefield had outlived most who remembered her work firsthand. President Taft sent condolences. The Red Cross sent flowers, but the real mourners were scattered across America. Aging veterans who owed her their lives, families who knew their sons' graves because of her, communities rebuilt after disasters by her hands. They couldn't attend, but they remembered. What legacy does someone leave when their work was saving others? No monuments bore her name. No battles were named for her. She left behind an organization that had already moved beyond her vision. But in thousands of homes across America, her picture hung on walls next to photos of sons she'd saved. In family Bibles, her name was written alongside births and deaths, a secular saint in Protestant homes. Here's the truth. history books miss. Clara Barton didn't just found the Red Cross. She changed how America thought about suffering. Before her, disaster was God's will or bad luck. Endured, not prevented. She showed that organized compassion could minimize tragedy, that preparation could save lives, that one person's stubbornness could force institutions to remember their humanity. Every disaster response plan, every emergency preparedness drill echoes her legacy. But her deepest impact was personal. Tens of thousands of soldiers lived because she refused to accept impossible. Their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren exist because one woman wouldn't stay home when propriety demanded it. How do you calculate that impact? How many discoveries, innovations, simple acts of kindness flow from lives that wouldn't have existed without her? The mathematics of mercy are incalculable. She also left a harder legacy, the knowledge that systems fail, that bureaucracies forget, that each generation must rediscover compassion for itself. The Red Cross she founded would face challenges she couldn't imagine: world wars, atomic weapons, disasters of unprecedented scale. Would it remember her core message? That behind every statistic was a human being deserving dignity? That efficiency without empathy was just organized abandonment? Today, we live in a world of professionalized disaster response. Trained experts, not battlefield angels. Coordinate relief. That's progress. But something was lost in that transition. Clara Barton reminded us that caring isn't a profession, it's a choice. That expertise without personal investment becomes mechanical. That sometimes the most important qualification is simply refusing to look away from suffering. You want to know her final lesson? It's this: ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide someone else's pain matters more than their own comfort. Clara Barton wasn't born special. She made herself extraordinary through choices. The choice to act when others hesitated, to persist when others quit, to remember when others forgot. Those choices are still available to us. Every day. What if your story could save a life a century after your death? Clara Barton's does. Every time the Red Cross responds to disaster, every time someone donates blood, every time a volunteer comforts a survivor, her story lives. Not as history, but as present action. She didn't just leave an organization. She left a question. When you see suffering, will you act? Look at our world. Natural disasters increasing. Wars displacing millions. Pandemics testing our compassion. We have technology Clara couldn't dream of. Resources she'd have considered miraculous. But technology without empathy is useless. Resources without will are wasted. The question isn't whether we can help, it's whether we will. Whether we'll see past statistics to humans. Whether we'll act despite inconvenience. Clara Barton faced the same excuses we use today. It's not my problem. Someone else will help. I'm not qualified. It's too dangerous. She heard them all and kept working. Because she understood a fundamental truth. In the face of suffering, inaction is complicity. Every time we scroll past a crisis, every time we change the channel, we make a choice. Not choosing is still choosing. But here's what's remarkable. Her standard wasn't perfection. She made mistakes, burned out, sometimes failed. What mattered was showing up, again and again. Past exhaustion, past criticism, past the point where any reasonable person would quit. She showed us that heroism isn't a single dramatic act. It's the accumulation of small mercies. The bandage applied, the letter written, the hand held, the promise kept. You're reading this on a device that connects you to global suffering in real time. You see more pain in a day than Clara saw in a year. It's overwhelming, paralyzing, easy to go numb. But she faced the same overwhelm on every battlefield. The solution wasn't to save everyone, impossible, but to save someone. To start where you are with what you have. To let perfect be the enemy of good. Her life asks uncomfortable questions. What suffering do you walk past? What systems do you accept because changing them seems too hard? What talents do you waste because using them for others is inconvenient? These aren't accusations. They're invitations. Invitations to discover what Clara knew. That purpose lies in service. That meaning comes from mattering to someone. That a life spent easing others' pain is a life well lived. The angel of the battlefield died 100 years ago. But angels aren't bound by time. Every act of compassion channels her spirit. Every refused cynicism honors her memory. Every time someone says, "I can help," instead of, "It's not my problem," Clara Barton lives again. She's not a figure from the past. She's a possibility in the present, waiting for you to pick up where she left off. So here's the challenge, the call, the question that echoes from Antietam to today. What battlefield are you avoiding? What suffering have you trained yourself not to see? What difference could you make if you decided right now that someone else's pain mattered more than your comfort? Clara Barton wasn't superhuman. She was stubbornly, persistently, courageously human, just like you. The only difference? She acted on it. Remember this. History forgets battles, but remembers compassion. Generals fade, but angels endure. Your battlefield might not involve bullets. It might be a homeless shelter, a classroom, a hospital ward, a neighbor in need, but it's there, waiting. And somewhere on that battlefield, someone is praying for an angel. Maybe it's time you answered that prayer. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage.